uh, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you for having us. We're delighted to be here and look forward to engaging your audience.
Outstanding. Let me just briefly introduce you and Mr. Dale. Mr. Dale is, we have, everyone, tonight we have Maya Rockamore, Dr. Maya Rockamore Cummings, who is the widow of the late Elijah Cummings, who was just an amazing congressman who served our country for 20 plus years in Congress. And the book that they have written is We're Better Than This. It came out early last year, end of 2020, I would say.
Yeah.
And we also have Mr. James Dale, who is an author who helped put this project together. It really details his life and times and the things that some really the amazing battles that he fought for our country to help us, especially during the last 4 years. So I will turn the floor over to Dr. Cummings and Mr. Dale. Thank you both.
Very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Firestein. I just thank you so much for hosting us to discuss this incredible story about an incredible man. Elijah, as many of you well know, was a son of Baltimore, not too far from Richmond. And, you know, I got married to him, back in 2008. And, he always had these incredible stories. And I really urged him to tell his story to the world because, he had so many incredible insights as well. And we looked for somebody to work with him on the book. And one day I was having lunch with a friend and I said, I'm trying to get Elijah to tell his story, but, I'm seeking somebody to work with him. And she said, I know just the person. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, he does this for a living. And she introduced me to James Dale and we met. And then I introduced him to Elijah and the rest is history. We're so proud of this book. It recently won an NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work Debut Author. It was also a national finalist for Audiobook of the Year. And so, this is an incredible story and about an incredible man, and you're about to hear more detail. Jim.
Thank you very much, Maya. It is a pleasure to be here. And as Maya said, this came about because she put this project together. I didn't know then, but I learned in history that she had really been encouraging Elijah to tell his story, and she connected with me, and then put me together with Congressman Cummings. We had an introductory session or two, and really clicked, and then began to work sort of nonstop from that point on. And I do want to say that, I have been writing books like this one, co-authoring with someone that helped tell their story for many years, but with a lot of different people, a lot of different interesting, great people. I've been very fortunate. But personally, for me, this book and this project in collaboration was the most meaningful and indelible experience of my writing life. In session after session, Congressman Cummings told me stories, and I began to formulate a structure from these stories, a sort of a quilted interweaving of the formative moments of his past, the child of sharecroppers living in segregated neighborhoods, struggling in school, all forming the fabric of everything that he was able to do in later life in Washington and Congress with presidents, the past informing the present and future. And very early in our writing sessions, I asked Elijah if there was one story in his past that rose above the rest, that stood out as being perhaps the most formative in his life. Without any hesitation, he recounted this experience, and I'm going to read an excerpt from it. When I was no more than 11 years old, my life was forever altered. I certainly didn't realize it at the time. I knew something important was happening, but it took a long while before the impact really hit me. We had a neighborhood community playground center where the kids would gather in the summer, with a small wading pool and some recreation counselors to watch over us. Our little wading pool was no more than a few feet across and very shallow, maybe up to your knees, filled with kids side by side. You had to take turns a half hour at a time. And after the third group, the water was pretty dirty. But that was the only way we had to get cool on a hot day. One day in late August, a lady came and asked us kids, how would you like to go to a real swimming pool, one with a diving board, an Olympic-sized pool? Well, we all thought that would be great, but how was that going to happen? She said there was a pool like that only a few blocks away from where we were, in Riverside Park, and that we deserved to go there, and she was going to take us. She said, you can swim to your heart's delight. Those were her words almost 50 years ago, to your heart's delight. Her name was Juanita Jackson Mitchell. To us, she was just this nice lady who was going to take us to a real swimming pool. We didn't realize until later that she was a civil rights pioneer from a family of civil rights pioneers and the first African-American woman to practice law in Maryland. Juanita Jackson Mitchell's mother was the inspirational Dr. Lily Jackson, who descended from a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but still had to attend the segregated colored high school. She rose to president of the Baltimore branch of the NAACP, became an early leader in nonviolent protest, and was known as the Mother of Freedom. Her daughter, Juanita, was married to Clarence Mitchell Jr., a national leader in civil rights and lobbyist for the NAACP, and they were parents of two state senators, Michael and Clarence III. Civil rights was practically the family business. What Mrs. Mitchell did not tell us that day about the nice pool she was taking us to was that it was totally segregated. No blacks allowed. She and her colleagues at the rec center, Jim Smith and Walter Black, were leading us on an integration march. There we were, a band of little kids walking down the streets of Baltimore from a black neighborhood to a white neighborhood, only a few blocks from each other, but worlds apart. Day after day, Juanita and Jim and Walter led about 30 of us, walking 10 or 15 blocks, while an angry mob, not of other kids, but of grown white adults, yelled names at us, told us to go home, and threw rocks and bricks at little kids. One of those rocks struck me in the forehead and caused a scar that I carry to this day. The police watched and the newspapers took pictures and ran stories, but nobody stopped the angry residents, and nobody stopped us. We kids would swim in the Riverside Park pool each day, then leave with neighbors yelling racial epithets and throwing debris and bottles, and white kids pushing black kids in the pool. I call them neighbors, ironically. Yes, we all lived within blocks of each other, but they were hardly neighborly. They were the opposite, people trying to keep us out of their neighborhood. Tensions were high. After taking Sunday off, they let us all back again on Monday, Labor Day. The hostility escalating. About that time, the Riverside Park citizens, clinging to their segregated white enclave, must have realized that we were all going to just keep coming back, because they stopped coming to their doorways and out into the streets, shouting and throwing rocks. Just as Juanita Mitchell promised, we all got to go to a real swimming pool. And as she said, we swam to our heart's delight. Even as little children, we had a sense of victory and fear. We'd gone off to play every day, but we ended up making history. That was in the early 1960s, and old rules and practices and even prejudices began slowly but steadily to change. Baltimore stayed largely segregated for the next 10 years, but it was the beginning, the root of what would evolve into a massive upheaval in social norms, change. For me, that was the beginning of wanting to become somebody who could make things change. I saw that Mitchell and the other people who made integration happen were lawyers, so I wanted to be a lawyer. These lawyers were young men and women who had the courage to walk up the streets and have people yell at them and be unafraid, to have little kids following them, trusting and believing in them, to make change happen. I wasn't sure what a lawyer was, what their job was, but I saw what they could accomplish. Oh my God, what a powerful force that could be. Change. Little black children getting what only white children had because we were, after all just kids, no matter what color, who wanted the same chances in life, the chance to swim in a pool, the chance to go to a good school or live in a nice neighborhood or see a better world. I wanted to be part of that change. And I've endeavored to do so ever since. And I've pursued it ever since. As for progress in achieving change, here's a fitting postscript. 30 years later, a man came up and identified himself as one of those in the angry mob and told me he was sorry. What is the right response to justice acknowledged, but so long delayed? I did not applaud his admission, nor did I spurn it. I said, apology accepted. Elijah Cummings told me he never forgot the swimming pool incident. It was formative. He said he often called upon the memory of it to fuel his actions in Washington. When he conducted hearings on the Trump immigration policy, separating mothers and children, putting them in cages, telling them to go back where they came from. When Trump launched his Twitter attack on Cummings' beloved hometown as a, quote, disgusting rat and rodent infested mess. When Elijah answered ABC's George Stephanopoulos' question, yes, Trump is a racist, no doubt about it. When Elijah walked the streets of Baltimore to calm his city after the senseless death of young Freddie Gray. At Freddie's funeral, when he asked those watching and listening, did you see him? Did you really see him? You see him in the casket and you see him on the news, but when he walked to school, when he played ball in the neighborhood, when he sang in the choir, did you see him? Elijah Cummings decried the invisible Black lives so often lost, never really seen. It's stories like these that made the fabric that interwove his life and mission. And now Maya, his wife and partner, who wrote the last chapter of the book after Elijah's death, will talk about that final chapter, about his last messages to us, and also about how he would have felt as the most recent events have unfolded. Maya.
Thanks, Jim. So everyone knows that Elijah then went on to become the first cohort of African-American students who integrated Baltimore City Public Schools and middle school. He then went to and attended and graduated with honors from a high school that's prestigious here in the city, and then went on to graduate from basically Howard University, Phi Beta Kappa. He got into the University of Maryland Law School, which only a few years earlier, our late Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall could not get into because he was African American. Elijah attended and graduated from the University of Maryland Law School, passed the bar on the first time, entered into a small little practice, and then went into politics, first entering the Maryland State Legislature, where he rose to become the first ever African American Speaker pro tem of that body, and then running for Congress and winning, and rising to become the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and the chair of the Oversight and Reform Committee. And so with that, I'm going to read a little excerpt and then we can have a discussion. And my excerpt is basically an updating to where we are today. After the Democrats regained the majority in the midterms, Elijah was the chairman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform. He was finally in a position to lead investigations and to set the agenda for hearings. But he was sober about the realities of the threats he and his committee would face from the Trump administration and congressional Republicans. Despite his pain, he threw himself into his work. Then, in late summer, just before his speech at the National Press Club, he took yet another bad turn and was readmitted to Johns Hopkins. The underlying suspicion was that the cancer had come back. Elijah was weaker than I'd seen him in years. A day before he was to give his speech, I asked if he still intended to do it. And he said, Maya, I'll be there if I have to crawl. Elijah was so drained that when his aides maneuvered him to the podium, pale and unsteady, I thought he might drop. Then he looked at the crowd, 4 or 5 times the size of what had been expected, before his investigations into the administration, before the shootings in Dayton and El Paso, and before Trump's Twitter attack on Baltimore and Elijah. He looked at the crowd and you could see him become energized. He exhorted the audience to listen, and more important, to take action. He was passionate as only Elijah Cummings could be. The gathering of usually callous Washington media cheered and gave him a standing ovation. Exhausted and barely able to keep going, he went straight back to the hospital. During the next few weeks, he managed to continue vital work. He was on the phone with Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, and his staff. He read testimony. He reviewed the impeachment updates. He signed subpoenas. So many times I said, Elijah, that's enough for today. Okay, I'll stop soon, he'd say. Doctors at Hopkins and the NIH monitored his cancer. It was obviously recurring. The question was, could they do anything to slow it down or limit it? We all did everything we could. There became, I think the best word is an inevitability to it all. He knew, and I suspected, we were coming to the end. It was coming as if you could see it like a train approaching in the distance. When you're not sure how far away it is, but you know it's steadily coming towards you. That's when he began to talk differently. He would say he was tired, no matter how much rest he got, just tired all the time. He complained of constant pain. It was clearly physical, but it was also emotional and spiritual. The inner Elijah was burning out. We talked about the past, what Elijah had done, and about the future and all that remained to be done, but we did not use the word death. We just knew. As if sped by his passing, events moved even faster in the days just after Elijah's death. On December 18, 2019, Speaker Nancy Pelosi banged the gavel and announced that the House of Representatives voted 230 to 197, strictly along party lines, to impeach President Donald J. Trump, the third president in the history of the United States to face impeachment charges. That evening, during her press conference, Nancy Pelosi spoke about Elijah. She honored him as a key force in the inquiry, calling him our North Star. And she quoted him, "When the history books are written about this tumultuous era, I want them to show that I was among those in the House of Representatives who stood up to lawlessness and tyranny." She added. He also said somewhat presciently, "When we're dancing with the angels, the question will be, what did you do to make sure we kept our democracy intact?" We did all we could, Elijah. We passed the 2 articles of impeachment. The president is impeached. As I often told people in the days after his death, Elijah's death wasn't just my loss. It was our loss as a nation. And we all have the responsibility to move his legacy forward. Because we know that with every transgression, every disregard for the Constitution, every attempt to act above the law, every denial of truth, our democracy is endangered. That's why, in the months and years ahead, we must continue to hear Elijah's voice. We're better than this. We are better than this. Yes, we are. We must be. So you see, Elijah's words, his deeds, and his legacy were indeed prescient, perhaps more so than any of us would have wished. Since his passing, we have lived through history. These are times that they will be writing about 200 years from now. From the first impeachment charge to the partisan acquittal, to the COVID pandemic and the botched response, Elijah would not have been surprised about the botched response from the Trump administration. To an ugly presidential campaign, mercifully to the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, to the claims of a stolen election, false claims of a stolen election by Donald Trump and his loyalists, to unfounded, outrageous lawsuits claiming voter fraud, to the dismissal of every single one of those suits, sometimes by judges that had been appointed by Donald Trump, to the Republican officials even denying President Trump's election lies, and to stalwarts like Bill Barr and Chris Christie just giving up and rejecting the fraud claims outright. But unfortunately, to the complicity of over 100 members of the United States Congress who are still sitting there, who voted to overturn a duly found election, the Electoral College votes for Biden and Harris, to Trump turning on his own vice president, basically putting his loyalists out to hunt Vice President Pence, and to the president himself inciting an invasion of the US Capitol, an insurrection against the heart of our democracy. That is what we have just lived through. And I get a lot of calls and people asking, what would Elijah have thought? What would he have done? As his worst fears come to pass, well, we don't need to worry. I wonder what he would have done. The fact of the matter is he told us in the book. He said, quote, democracy literally means a government run by the people. People don't always agree, but to get anywhere, especially in the polarizing arena of politics, we have to find common ground, something to build trust and respect on. You also have to teach people that you have boundaries, bottom lines, things you will not do, behaviors you will not put up with, places you will not go. As in a democracy, having our own checks and balances teaches our friends, as well as our leaders, what we will and will not accept. If Elijah was alive on January 6th, he would have been standing over on the Senate side, begging the Senate to convict Donald J. Trump. He would have said that this is completely unacceptable. And he would have said, we are absolutely better than this. And so with that, I would welcome an opening of the conversation, and however you'd like to direct the conversation, we are happy to go. Jim, you're with me?
I'm here.
Okay.
So Scott, we give it back to you.
Right, so we're inviting participants on this Zoom to put questions in the comment section, and Ben is going to help me deliver those to you. I have to say, one of the things that Congressman Cummings really highlighted in the book was the vote and the importance of the vote. It is just so fascinating to me after reading this and thinking about that and where we're at today. You know, what happened in Georgia and now what happened with the election. It's going to be interesting to see where we go with this and how we can hopefully put some guardrails on things.
Absolutely. Elijah would have been, first of all, he wouldn't have been surprised because, you know, he saw a lot out of his Republican colleagues in terms of their efforts to basically deny the power of people that they felt would vote Democratic. And those often tended to be people of color, sometimes seniors, sometimes students. And so, you know, Elijah had one of the big cases that he had in terms of his investigation was to shut down the Republican efforts to try to upend and to diminish the census. And so when they tried to insert the census question about citizenship, Elijah actually fought that. And that, of course, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was discovered that they were being advised by a Republican consultant who clearly said and stated that their efforts to diminish the census was directly an effort to amplify the white vote and the conservative vote in this country and to diminish that of Democrats and Black and brown people. And so, you know, we don't have to wonder whether racism exists in this country because we've seen it up close and personal over the last several years. Right now, what we need to do as a nation is that we need to realize that our democracy is precious and that we all belong to it, and that there are no superior beings in this democracy, that we are all equal in this, not only in the sight of God, but in terms of our common humanity. And so with that, what we are looking forward to is moving towards a multicultural democracy, one where everyone can walk hand in hand and our children can enjoy a future where every child gets an opportunity to live up to their greatest potential.
I think you saw, Scott, we all saw in Georgia the power of the vote. And now we've seen how powerful it is that the backlash from so many different state legislatures attempting to limit the vote in those states, because they saw what happened when people were galvanized and motivated to come out and vote. They said, well, what can we do? They're saying, what can we do to make it more difficult? And I think that Elijah would have said he's heartened by what happened in Georgia, not surprised by the backlash to it, but also would say, you see what happens when people desperately value their vote, they're going to get out and vote. And that's That's the ultimate weapon we have. As Maya said, this democracy is precious. And it may seem like, sometimes we take it for granted. Some people may think some people are being overly dramatic. It's not overly dramatic. It's on the line every day on a local level and on a national level.
Yeah, it's been pretty profound. We've been fortunate in Richmond that last fall we did a common book reading with the One Person No Vote, the Carol Anderson book. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but she really details efforts to dilute voting in our country and disenfranchise people. And you mentioned Georgia. Stacey Abrams also has a wonderful book out that details that, her efforts. And she really was the force that made that much better. But it's been shocking to see what's happened since the election.
Yeah,
this winter in their
By the way,
legislative.
it's not unprecedented. We've
No.
seen this before in the history of this country. I cite the first Reconstruction after people held as slaves were released following the Civil War. We tried to reconstruct this nation and give Black people of African descent, an opportunity to join into mainstream society. We saw African American members of Congress rise to the fore. We saw, Black business women and men do their thing. There were schools that were constructed for Black students. Certainly we saw Black people voting in this country at levels that allowed them to have representation in Congress and at state legislatures. And then what happened was the Compromise of 1776, where they basically allowed, Rutherford B. Hayes to basically retrench. And then the state legislatures and the localities all took the same actions to pull back in terms of the allowances that had been made around voting. And then that diminished, and it created for the next 50 plus years, the Jim Crow regime, where African Americans were denied the right to vote. They were denied the ability to go into, common stores. They had separate and unequal facilities, schools, you name it. And so what we're seeing here is a historical force, one that we've seen before. And people who claim that this is partisanship need to understand that what this is an attempt to deny people their basic citizenship rights, which ultimately deny them a right to have a voice in our society, which then denies them the right to thrive. And so I don't care if you think it's partisanship. It's fundamental to human rights, and it's a violation of human rights. And we can do better than this.
There is
I'm sorry, someone has raised a question. They would like to know how your husband would help us bridge this divide. And he does talk about that a lot in the book, how as the oversight committee chair, he really, it seemed like you described how he built coalition and had compassion and grace,
yeah,
and thoughtfulness for the perspectives that were being presented.
Very, very much so. Very much so. I mean, I asked him many times when we were working on the book. He talked about friendships he had that were on the floor of Congress, and I would sometimes say, "Well, Elijah, are you really friendly honestly with Mark Meadows?" He said, "Yeah," and he would laugh and say, "Yeah, I know." I mean, he knew that it was considered by many people to be, sort of an odd couple friendship. But he had a great deal of respect for opposing views. It didn't mean he was going to bend to those views. And he knew in many cases that he was not going to bring that person over to his view. But he often would say, if we find 10% or 15% of issues that we might agree on, we can make some things change. It was probably, and I think Maya can speak to this more specifically, but during the Trump era, I think he realized that you could not find the 15% areas. Many of the colleagues he had who might have been willing in the past to talk about some of these issues were quite literally afraid to do so. issues that do have common bounds, whether it might be environmental issues, it might be voting issues. They would just became sort of frozen and terrified by it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw an article 2 weeks ago where Republicans said that, that they feared for their lives if they opposed Trump.
Okay.
They feared for their lives. Now, Elijah and I lived some of that fear, and we're not going to go into that here. But definitely what we had in office was a man who absolutely was willing to use the power of the office to go after his enemies. And so, let me just say this. I think that many people would have called perhaps Elijah foolish for going in to seek to meet with Donald Trump personally. But he held true to his principles that, you have to try. If it doesn't work out, that's another story, but you have to try to find common ground. So he went to the White House. We went to the inauguration. We went to the luncheon celebrating Mr. Trump's win as president of the United States. Elijah went up to Donald Trump and asked to meet with him. And Pence, to his credit, made that happen. And Elijah became, I think, the first, if not one of the first, members of Congress to meet with Donald Trump in the Oval Office. He thought it was a good conversation. He thought the president was on the up and up. But as soon as he stepped out of that room, the president went on camera and lied. Now, what we found is that the president is a habitual liar. And that was made evident through the course of his presidency. But Elijah was shocked. And so with that, Elijah grew to understand that Donald Trump was somebody who could not be trusted. He was somebody who sought to use the tools of government to subvert our democracy. And he was someone whom Elijah felt was a threat, not just to our form of government, but also to our humanity.
I think that that today, if he were alive, he would have certainly embraced his philosophy of reaching across not only the aisle, but even within the Democrat, reaching across to people who might not share the same view. It didn't change his belief in that philosophy. It caused him to be realistic about the chances during this particular period of time. This is not the way he would prefer to have it by any means. And remember, he was in Congress, as you said, it's close to 24 years. It wasn't all, lots of times the Democrats were not in power. Lots of times it was not as dire as it was in these last couple of years.
But interestingly enough, even despite the huge divisiveness, Elijah kept the channels of communication open.
Yeah.
He still communicated with Mark Meadows and the Freedom Caucus and the leadership of the Republican Party. And so he never shut down the lines of communication. He kept them open. But the reality was that there were not two parties willing to actually come to common ground. It was a one-sided affair. And so with that, we are where we are.
So here's a question, and it really relates to what we're talking about right now. How did Congressman Cummings balance the individual career of being in office with his obvious desire to be of service and empower the community he represented?
What's the question again?
So how did he balance his career of being in office with his desire to be of service and empower the community he represented?
It's the one and the same. Being in office is actually serving. When you run for a public position, an elected office, you are actually running to serve the people. And that is a full-time 24/7 job. Elijah, was representing the people of Baltimore and the state of Maryland in the U.S. Congress, making sure that he was advancing their interests on a daily basis in terms of legislation, making sure through his committee assignments that he was either bringing home the bacon in terms of his transportation committee, making sure that the federal dollars that should go to transportation projects were coming to his state of Maryland. Through the Oversight and Reform Committee, his job was to oversee, make sure the government itself worked, to oversee the government. And he did that, and he did it incredibly well, and I'm so proud of him. But people don't realize that there's a whole nother aspect to this job, and that is back home. You got to go attend, graduations, college graduations, high school graduations, speaking here, speaking there, speaking everywhere, conducting meetings, helping people with constituent services. If they have a social security problem, making sure that that gets resolved. If they have an immigration problem, making sure that gets resolved. There are so many responsibilities associated with the job of congressman and congresswoman. And it's all in the line of service. So the job is one and the same.
It really is. And Scott, I think you hit on something though, because that brazen ambition that we see in many politicians is often at the disregard of their constituency. They're not out to hurt their constituency, perhaps, but they're out to advance their own position. What's my next step? What's my next job? How do I raise my profile? If I alienate some people in my district, I'll tell them a story. I'll rewrite history in my next speech. Elijah, as Maya said, Elijah was this was the job he took seriously. Was I used to joke about it, laugh about it, because I would be walking into his office to work with him on the book. And he might be coming in or going out, or one of his people. And the people would, they called him Elijah. Hey, how you doing, Elijah? When I visited him in Washington, going down the hall, I was talking with him one day about, we were in the midst of a heavy story about, something he had negotiated, a hearing he was going to have. And his phone rang and he took the call. And it was I believe a young woman who, I didn't hear the other end, but I sort of got the gist of it. And the point was that she had called to get some counsel on an internship that he thought she was very qualified for. And someone in his staff had evidently said they'd call back and didn't call back in as timely a way. Well, he said, I don't know, I'm guessing she was, I'm going to say a young college student. So I'm going to just say she's 20 years old. He's apologizing to her. This shouldn't happen. I'm going to make sure so-and-so calls you back. And she must have said, okay, well, when will I expect it? He said, in 5 minutes, he's going to call you back. And then he hung up with this person. He called so-and-so and he said, here, you call back. And then he turned to me and he went and now we went back to, a hearing on immigration. So we went from the absolute grassroots of one person in his district up to the highest level.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize that it was 24/7. So I couldn't send, if I forgot something at the store and I was cooking, I could not send Elijah to go pick up what I forgot, because it would take him 2 hours to get back home. Because people were lining up to talk to him, to ask him for things. When we went to church on Sunday morning, there were a line of people always lined up to ask him for stuff. And so, that is the nature of the job. It is service. And Elijah did it, and he did it well because it was his calling.
Was it Maya? I'm trying to remember what you told me. The story, it was after the book. It was a story of him stopping. Was it the Morgan choir that he saw them on the street and stopped to talk to them?
The Howard choir, the
Howard choir. And he just stopped his whole entourage and said, I'm going to talk to these people. And I thought it was, I saw the picture of it. I thought it was a speech that had been planned and booked. No.
Impromptu.
You mentioned in the book faith, and I'm curious as to what role faith really played in his life, and how did it help him through, like, I just, all of the stories about the oversight committee, the Benghazi, the Trey Gowdy, the awful meeting with Trump where he took a compliment or a hope that he had for President Trump and just turned it into a fabrication. And he did credit you, Dr. Cummings, Rockamore Cummings, with, helping him refine that during his time with you.
Yeah, so Elijah was a man of deep faith. He was the son of two preachers. He was the grandson of a preacher. Many people thought he was a preacher himself because of the cadence of his voice and, the themes that he often talked about. But Elijah viewed his job as a ministry, and he was deeply rooted in faith. He often started his day off listening to Christian music. And often meditated, really being thoughtful and prayerful about what to say and what to do. So, I would say that God and faith basically shaped every aspect of his lived experience, and it was with him to the very end.
He talked about every time he gave a speech or talk, that he would ask God to make sure he said the right thing and act as a sort of a filter of his thoughts.
That's right.
Wow. Do we have any other questions coming in?
I think while we're waiting, there's another aspect that we have kind of hinted at, and Maya talked about it in her story in the section in the last chapter. When he wrote this book, and in fact, when he conducted his career, he would often say he was in a hurry. And he was in a hurry because he was an impatient man. He was a man who had vision about what he wanted to get done. But he was also in a hurry because of his illness that dogged him for 25 years. Then almost no one knew about it. Certainly few knew about it to the extent that it existed, the threat that it posed, that he really, by many statistics, might have died after 6 months of his early diagnosis. You talk about a man who got up every day in a hurry because he didn't know how long it was going to be. That's a pretty strong driver if you have a moral center and a goal and a set of goals in mind. And you couple that with faith and you say, well, I think he felt faith was keeping him alive, was helping him, along with a lot of very, very high-powered medicine, was helping him keep him alive. And he kept doing what he had to do because he had to hurry to do it.
And a sense of purpose. And Jim, I do think, and I've mentioned this to you before, that Elijah and his siblings, they never missed a day of school.
Right.
And so his father always had a saying that if a child of mine missed a day of school, that meant that child died the night before. And so, his father basically taught them the lesson of discipline. Even the lesson of discipline at great personal sacrifice, because I can imagine that at some point, they were all legitimately sick, and yet they still showed up to school. And so I think that discipline, he carried through the rest of his life.
Yeah. So he was truly legitimately very, very sick, and he kept going to school every day.
He kept going.
Yeah.
Well, and the story of how he would study on Friday night and get up early and do his chores on Saturday morning when he was at Howard, or it might have been at law school too, but it sounded like he was very disciplined when it came to making sure that he was getting his work done. And again, it sounded like he was in a hurry.
Elijah was disciplined. It was absolutely amazing how disciplined he was. But yes, and people don't know, but when he was elected to Congress, he was undergoing chemotherapy. He did chemo and kept up his floor schedule in the U.S. Congress. And people can say, well, how did he do it? He would go to chemo and he would rest in the gym of the U.S. Congress and then go up to the floor and do votes and study while he was laying down resting. I mean, literally at no point did he ever feel sorry for himself. He just kept going.
Well, and did he really put on sweatpants on the weekends?
Occasionally.
It was hard for me to believe that in the book, that Saturday he'd be in a sweatsuit out around town.
Occasionally, yeah. No, he had his sweatpants for his exercise. He would do walks. He had a little bicycle, and he would wear his sweatpants out and about with his cap on. He always had a Howard University cap or a Ravens cap. So yeah, I mean, he was casual on occasion, but most times that man was in a suit, buttoned up, tie.
Yeah. And he would work, I often said in working on the book that I felt I couldn't let up because he was working all the time. He was working on the business of government. And then I would send him a text at 10 o'clock at night and he'd write back to me at 10:05. And I often said that I saw texts the following morning I'd send something at midnight because I didn't want to forget it. I'd wake up in the morning and there were 3 answers.
What would you all say was his the accomplishment that he had in Congress and in life that he was most proud of?
Yeah. So, we get this question a lot. And so, I think that, of course, he was proud of his daughters, his children. He was proud of the youth program in Israel that he founded, and it still operates today. It basically takes young, primarily African American students from the Baltimore area and gives them a chance to travel to Israel, and then they provide support for them to tutoring support. The program has had 100% graduation rate from high school and a 95% graduation rate from college. That's cohorts of more than 21 cohorts of students have now come through it. They have gone to prestigious universities. They have come out and become leaders in their communities. There's one that's a news anchor on CNN. I mean, they're just incredible. And that all came from a lot of hard work that Elijah did in connection with the community. And it's a great program.
He was a lifelong mentor in many ways.
And then people want to know, well, what legislative accomplishments? I mean, I have a 6-page legislative summary of the things that he's introduced, the things that have passed, of the money that he's brought to the Baltimore region, et cetera. I think that he was proud of all that stuff. He worked hard to make it happen. And so, legislatively, there were just a lot of great things that he's done over the years. And if I were to say that there was one thing that he's proud of, I think that it would have to go towards, some of the work that he did in the committees to defend and protect our democracy, to stand up for the kids at the border, to stop Toyota from, selling cars with faulty brakes so that, Americans could live. There's so many things that people forget that Elijah was a driving force on. And he did it because he believed in America, the American people, and he wanted to use his position of power to better the lives of others.
Yeah, his service on the oversight committee. Wow. I mean, that must have been such a challenge.
Yeah, indeed.
And I think you capture the story about the Israel. It's about how he describes children as the helping us in the future that we'll never see.
Our children are the living messages we send to a future we will never see. And so, what we're teaching them, how we're supporting them, what, they observe, these are the messages that we send to a future. Think of our children as time capsules. That was what Elijah was saying. Yeah. That, that they are a reflection of what they learned in our era, and they go into the future and either extend what they have observed, or certainly, or defend or regress in terms of the era in which we exist. So he thought that our children, service to our kids and support for our kids was the highest order value, something that we all must do, because they are absolutely our bridge to the future.
I don't have any other questions. I think that's just probably, to me, that was the most touching message, one of the most touching messages in the book. That really resonated with me.
Yeah, it's a beautiful saying, and it's absolutely true.
It's one of the reasons, in a way, that we are so pleased actually to be doing these sessions at libraries, because libraries are such a connective institution, particularly for children. They had a huge impact on Elijah himself. He was a great supporter of libraries in general, of libraries specifically within his district, of the concept of libraries. So we sort of feel like every time we do one of these sessions that we're kind of connecting the way he would.
Absolutely.
Well, and you can rest assured that we will connect this book to as many people as we can.
Good.
We have many copies and we are checking them out and we are giving them away. And we're, you know, when I give a book away, I say, okay, I would like you to read it, but I want you to pass it on.
Good.
Because, you know, that's how we share and that's how we promote democracy and keep our democracy safe, in my humble opinion.
Well,
And, you know, there is so much. We are probably the first and last fact checkers in our democracy, and having a literate country is one of the biggest safeguards we can have. And so our public library, we have really had to evolve during the pandemic. I have to really compliment my staff during this whole time. They have like pivoted and adapted to provide books and services as safely as we can. We're just getting open again. And I am just really pleased to have opportunities like this to share Congressman Cummings' story. It took such courage for you all to write, you know, to tell this story and put it together. It was definitely, you can feel that it's a labor of love in this, but it's definitely just such a suiting memorial to such a patriot of our country.
thank you.
So,
Well, we're so glad to be here, and we're happy to hear that we're live streaming this on YouTube.
And I want to congratulate the Richmond Public Library and Mr. Firestein. I just deeply appreciate it, and congratulations for all of the great work you do in the Richmond area and in support of our democracy, because he's absolutely right. A literate public, a literate and active public is absolutely the essential building block of democracy. So thank you.
Thank you.
well, thank you for telling this story, and we will share it. That's for sure.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.